the honourable member for Nelson.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak on the budget, and at the outset I express my appreciation to other members in this place for their contributions. I always appreciate the variety of expertise and insight and analysis that's brought to this place through those contributions, Mr President, and I think across all of us we give it a pretty good going over, which is, as we should, is our role in this place. Now, onto the budget then, Mr President. Budget repair was the order of the day, but I have to ask, what budget repair? What I see and feel when I look at this budget is more like budget despair, to be honest. Despair for those reliant on the community services being cut, despair for those facing the impossible task of reconciling fast deleting coffers with ever-increasing need and demand, despair for those impacted by the further loss of 1,700 full-time equivalent positions in our state service, recognising that that could involve more than 1,700 actual people, actual Tasmanians out of work, should those positions involve job shares and part-time workers. Despair for those languishing on healthcare waiting lists, trying to fathom what $700 million in cuts to health services will mean for them. Despair for the squandered opportunities which lay trampled underfoot of this government as they charge along their ideologically driven course yet again, Mr President. And that is the kicker. There were opportunities for alternative restorative action to be taken to put the state onto an economically sound and socially just fiscal footing, but instead this government indulged in years of pork barrelling, of irresponsible expenditure, gambling away our state while racking up enormous debt through mismanagement of key projects, culminating now in this budget in the community having to pay the price. Mr President, we are presented with a very grim budget for the 2026-27 financial year, described actually though as a precursor to further austerity years, because the two following years look decidedly harsher and decidedly bleaker according to the forward estimates presented in these budget papers. People are rightly asking, how did we get here? How has our state reached the point that despite recognised social need across integral sectors such as education, health, housing, climate change mitigation, the need to address increasing cost of living pressures, it can no longer afford to do so? We can't afford to do the basics our Tasmanian people need. And basically these budget papers state the government cannot meet the needs of our community. How did we get here, Mr President? Indeed. We are all aware of both the nation's and the state's economic vulnerability to external, unpredicted events, such as the current war between the United States and Iran, or looking back the COVID-19 pandemic. Fair enough. However, as we have been informed by a range of commentators and experts, the deterioration of the state's financial position, in fact, began prior to COVID. Yes, it was exacerbated by the necessary financial assistance packages across the business and community that were rolled out during and immediately post the pandemic years. However, as members who were here at the time would recall, I and others, many others, called for a coherent and expert-driven review of our state's financial framework to help drive an appropriate to scale and community-centred approach to restructuring and rebuilding our financial framework post the pandemic. On the one hand, it's arguable the pandemic did show that with political will, we could look after the most vulnerable in our community. We could put a roof over people's heads, for example. We could prioritise targeted healthcare delivery. We could invest in innovative and flexible education and other service delivery models. Yes, at a cost and a scale that nobody expected to necessarily continue indefinitely, but what it did demonstrate was the need. Hence my call at the time for an independent expert review commissioned by the State Parliament to evaluate whether our current, at the time, financial framework was fit for purpose, was pulling the right progressive levers when it comes to our revenue and expenditure mix, and whether we were bogged down with dated regressive approaches that needed to be dispensed with. Instead, at the time, the then Premier of the day, Mr Gutwein, went with his PESRAC model, which I argued was limited and flawed at the time, and I still contend that, Mr President. And I won't repeat my extensive arguments about that here, but it was a flawed model and it did not deliver us a true and right way out of that predicament. Suffice to say, though, sadly, I've been proven correct when I raised concerns at the time about the PESRAC outcomes, which focused on cutting and reshaping TASTAFE and the disproportionate reliance on building our way out of the pandemic, which prioritised the construction industry over many other sectors, which also contribute to our state's bottom line as well as our community's well-being. The failure to seize the moment and the impetus when the state was looking at reshaping itself post-pandemic to stem the deterioration of our financial situation in a consulted, coherent and managed manner was, I firmly believe, a missed opportunity which has cost us dearly, Mr President. On another level, the failure to heed and comprehensively implement the 77 recommendations of the Watts Independent Review of the Tasmanian State Service, which reported in 2021, is another irresponsible missed opportunity, which needs to be named up here, Mr President, as a precursor to this budget. The Watts Review was established to evaluate whether the state service was fit for purpose for now and into the future. To quote from the DPAC website, Mr President, the Watts Review resulted in, and I quote, a roadmap to reform. And it outlined this is the part I'll quote. It outlined administrative improvements to transform current structures, services and practices to deliver a more efficient and effective public service. Yet, despite the government accepting all 77 recommendations towards that end, Mr President, in principle, the last update indicates only 15 of the recommendations were implemented in full and a further 20 underway. Even adding those together, you still get to less than half of the 77 recommendations total. There is something quite frankly perverse in this government spouting nonsense about right-sizing our public service when it so manifestly failed over the past 5 years to implement the independent expert recommendations to do just that. Potentially, a more timely and focused delivery of that suite of reforms from the Watt Review may have already identified and delivered savings and efficiencies in our public service, which we would be seeing the benefit of now and put us ahead of the curve instead of facing this cliff that's in this budget. Instead of heeding those earlier structural reform calls and independent reform packages, we saw successive iterations of this government indulge in gross election pork barrelling, corporate welfare and, of course, large-scale capital works such as the divisive AFL Stadium on Macquarie Point. Warnings were not heeded, Mr President, and instead the government chose to keep on piling on the debt while at the same time refusing to engage in a mature discussion regarding the need to review our revenue capacity and sources. Let's look at what exactly this 26-27 budget does set us up for across a few key areas, Mr President. And sadly, predictions were confirmed that cuts to state service jobs and services would be the almost exclusive lever supposedly pulled to shift us onto a budget repair trajectory. At the outset, I consider such a focus, almost to the exclusion of other potential levers, as an indication of the extent to which this budget is predicated upon ideology rather than sound, sustainable fiscal structural reform. While being framed as a return to a smaller pre-pandemic public service, apparently a right-sized public service, Mr President, in my opinion, the attempt to balance the books by cutting $1.47 billion from the state service is an even more extreme demonstration of that ideological lens than people expected. And further, it is false economy. The effects will be far-reaching should these cuts be even partially delivered. We cannot keep demanding that the state service deliver more with less, Mr President. What is the right size state service? The budget papers tell us the government has decreed the right size of the state service is no more than 44% of the state's revenue. But according to whom? How does this apparently arbitrary nexus reflect the community's needs for services and support? Targeted to regional and sector needs, Mr President. The government is quick to refer, without evidence, to a right-sized state sector while remaining conveniently silent about whether we have the right mix or scale of revenue on the other side of the equation, Mr President, a matter which I will discuss further in my contribution at a later stage. And although it has been noted that in these budget papers specific savings measures are indicated against particular agencies and departments, which is a better level of detail than we've had in the past, there is no transparency about how those amounts were arrived at, let alone how they will impact health services, school and education services, protection of our waterways and parks, our justice obligations, our social housing targets, or capacity to meet crisis accommodation demand, just to name a few, Mr President. Cutting state service roles is a cut in services, Mr President. It is a false economy when it's done as a blunt instrument, as in this budget. We must also keep in mind this is at least round 3 following successive financial years of being subjected to efficiency dividends. Those efficiency dividends have apparently been targeting backline positions the entire time. They must be largely gone already, Mr President, I would have thought. And besides that, it is a lazy furphy to suggest that cutting what can be termed backline or back office positions does not impact services delivered. We all know that instead of increased efficiencies or productivity, in far too many cases, the work undertaken by those who would be defined as backline or back office positions doesn't just evaporate when those people are cut from the equation. Instead, it shifts onto the desks and the shoulders of those considered frontline or essential, impacting their efficiency, their productivity, and in growing numbers, their morale. For example, I'm aware that currently our Parks and Wildlife Service is struggling to comply with a range of statutory obligations due to shortage of staff. Further, it's currently unable to ensure commercial tour operators are complying with their requirements, which actually results in loss of licence and other revenue. This situation is exacerbated by the fact that there is nobody on deck in this particular area except volunteers for up to 120 days per year, apparently. This is just one example where so-called efficiency dividends have actually delivered perverse outcomes, potentially, and the state may in fact be losing revenue as a result, Mr President. Clearly, that sort of example is false economy in action. Another example of false economy would be the former Efficiency and Productivity Unit, the EPU, Mr President, housed in DPAC, which now appears to have been made redundant. Given the EPU online survey commenced in 6th of November 2025 and it's scheduled to close by 31st of May this year, what's that, maybe a couple of days from now, Mr President, one wonders to what degree any suggestions received has been considered and incorporated into this decree from on high that 1,700 jobs are surplus to the community's requirements. Mr President, the seemingly arbitrary determination about the right-sized state service and the depth of the projected funding cuts without any supporting evidence or forward-looking restructure plan risks eroding our critical core knowledge, our institutional and governance knowledge and the skills base of our public service. While we know at the same time that need and demand is growing. And of course, greater genuine efficiencies and productivity should always be sought. But there is an important distinction to make between efficiency and simple cost cutting. Mr President, they cannot be assumed to be the same thing or expected to deliver the same outcomes. But there is no nuance in this budget, Mr President. And speaking of outcomes from cuts, Mr President, we know people across the Tasmanian community are under real pressure. Equally, the community services providing the support the most vulnerable people here need are under immense pressure also as demand for their services grow. TASCOS outlined this very clearly in its state budget wrap-up, and I'm going to quote from that state budget wrap-up from TASCOS. They said this: "Many of the positive measures announced in the budget were short-term and temporary at a time when the uncertainty facing Tasmanians demanded long-term investment. The Treasurer's commitment to a caring community cannot exist without early prevention support, housing security and sustainable community services, which were not made priorities in the budget. We are deeply concerned around the long-term impacts of reduced funding over the forward estimates for community services, with expenditure by output projected to be cut by 13.6% from last year's budget. We'll be seeking further detail on what this means, but on the face of it, this would represent a significant reduction in the capacity of our industry to respond to growing demand and future crises. End of quote, Mr President. That could not be clearer. That is TASCOS, peak body for our community services sector, saying this budget is undercutting that sector and puts it at risk, in jeopardy, and therefore the services it delivers to the Tasmanian people, our most vulnerable Tasmanian people, at risk and in jeopardy. The TASCOS budget wrap-up goes on to say this, and I'll quote, "Through the Tasmanian Coalition of Community Service Peaks, Prioritise All Tasmanians campaign, we called on the government to protect community services from cuts and commit to long-term funding certainty, because when services can't cope with demand, Tasmanians miss out. TASCOS and many members remain deeply concerned by projected reductions in the community services output group expenditure over the forward estimates, with funding forecast to decline by 13.6% compared to last year's budget. This creates serious uncertainty about the industry's future capacity to respond to growing demand." And they say this as well, Mr President. "Given increasing workforce and operational costs across the industry, TASCOS is calling for the indexation review to be brought forward and deliver a transparent, evidence-based indexation formula that reflects the true cost of delivering community services." Now that's significant, Mr President. They have said they are deeply concerned about the reductions projected in this budget, that they will not be able to respond to growing demand, and they point to indexation. And just as a little bit of a matter of history here, because I come from this sector, Mr President, before I came to this place 7 years ago, I spent 20 years in that sector. And for the last 10 of those years, I was with organisations that were regularly advocating on behalf of the sector for the funding of their services and for appropriate indexation. Indexation is something, appropriate indexation, modelled and properly in place and committed to over a long term, that can be relied upon by the community services sector, is something that has been missing under this government for the past 12 years. This government has failed year after year after year to give this certainty. They've held it like a carrot out in front of our community services sector, like a carrot for them to be chasing. And it's never been delivered properly, and it's still being dangled like a carrot out in front of this sector. And the sector is saying, please bring this forward and actually get this done. Model this out, give us a transparent, evidence-based indexation formula for our funding arrangements that we can rely on and plan for. It's still not there, Mr President, and the sector is crying out for it, as it has been the entire time this Liberal government has been in place since 2014. 13? It's been a long time, Mr President, too long in my opinion. This is a sector that we take for granted, and particularly that this government takes for granted again and again and again. It's just assumed that they will suck it up and keep supporting people because from the goodness of their hearts, that's what they're all about in the community services sector. Well, that's just, quite frankly, appalling and shameful for that to be taken for granted, Mr President. I noted this in COTA's state budget response statement. They said this: "Of significant concern to COTA and our colleagues in the Coalition of Community Service Peaks is the projected reduction in funding for the community service organisations across the forward estimates." And they go on to say, Mr President, that that cut would have, and I quote, "real consequences, with more Tasmanians at risk of missing out on essential support and care. Community organisations are the backbone of support for many older Tasmanians. A cut of this scale will have real and immediate consequences for people who rely on these services to stay healthy, connected and independent." And there's the thing, Mr President, when we start to look at particular cohorts who are being supported through our community services sector, they are cohorts that typically have vulnerabilities and need services and support for particular sorts of engagement, whether that's in our community, whether that's in our economy, whether that's with other services like our health system. When we undermine these services and support, we not only cripple that direct service delivery done by the community services sector, it ripples out. It ripples out because it will then have an impact on, say, our health system. It will have an impact on our education system. It will have an impact on our economy, ultimately. It will have an impact on our community cohesion. And that's something that I think a lot of people would be concerned about, Mr President, because I know a lot of people in the Tasmanian community are concerned about issues around community cohesion. And when we're not delivering the basics for our community, when we're not supporting them in the most fundamental ways, what happens is cracks grow deeper between people, and our community begins to feel the effects of those cracks when it comes to cohesion. Mr President, a caring community, according to the Treasurer, is what this budget is delivering. A caring community, says the Treasurer. However, in its budget wrap-up, TASCOS reflected on the urgent cost of living pressures that are continuing to be ignored by the Liberal government, despite what may be claimed. TASCOS says this about those pressures, and I'll quote, "But cost of living relief for households is an oversight." An oversight, Mr President, just to make that really clear, an oversight. Actually, how can we say that even? It's such a mild word, actually, for something that's quite appalling. An oversight. And I'll go on to with the quote, Mr President. Cost of living relief for households is an oversight and will impact the ability for families to afford the rising cost of rent, bills and other amenities, which are compounded by conflicts offshore. At a time when the government continues to invest heavily in projects like the Macquarie Point Stadium and a $500 million bailout to TT Line, Tasmanians are entitled to ask why the same level of urgency is not being applied. End of quote. And believe me, Mr President, thousands upon thousands of Tasmanians are asking why and how this government can have so grotesquely butchered its priorities in this way. We know that there are substantial investments and reforms that have been in train in our child and family and our youth justice spaces as a result of the Commission of Inquiry, Mr President. We know that these all require continued commitment, not just to implement them on paper, but to implement them fully in practice, because the ultimate aim that we are all trying to achieve is to make Tasmanian children safer in this state. We've already seen through our Joint Standing Committee scrutinising the implementation of these recommendations, Mr President, we've already seen some warning lights flashing around the fact that continued, appropriately targeted, but also an appropriate quantum of funding to implement these recommendations is absolutely essential. A lot of them require significant workforce development and expansion. A lot of them require more investment into training and skilling up our workforces across all these related sectors. A lot of them require new skills into spaces that they hadn't been, at a level they hadn't been required before. All of this will cost money, Mr President, and all of it needs to be done now in the face of significant cuts to be expected across these sectors. So that's something that I think all of us may have some concerns, some significant concerns about in terms of where to from here implementing our Commission of Inquiry recommendations and achieving that ultimate outcome of safer institutions in relation to our Tasmanian children. I do note that some of the community sector folk acknowledged the investments that had been made in some of these areas, the fact that the budget papers do point to funding specifically towards some of the recommendations made from the Commission of Inquiry that are in the process of being implemented, and that's fine. But we also have to see what will the cuts mean and where will that potentially undermine the good efforts that have been in train in these spaces. TASCOS said when they were in their budget wrap-up reflecting on this area that while funding has been directed towards statutory and crisis responses, there appears to be less focus on the community-based supports that prevent children and young people and families reaching those systems in the first place. This raises important questions about the government's long-term commitment to prevention, early intervention and community-led reform. And I agree, Mr President, with that statement. We will have to wait and see to some extent, and I hope what we're not going to see is things fall in a hole as these reforms continue to play out. Mr President, it's hard not to always include in these sorts of reflections on state budgets some comments around housing and affordable housing in particular, because it's such a fundamental challenge in our state, particularly for Tasmanians who are most vulnerable. And again, I'm going to quote from some of our community sector colleagues, because they are at the front line of this and they know when they read the budget papers exactly what it's going to mean for the people that they work with and support. So again, TasCos said this in its budget wrap-up. Tasmania's housing crisis continues to worsen, with housing affordability at record lows. Rental stress is increasing and the social housing wait list continues to grow, reaching another record 5,533 applicants, representing more than 9,000 Tasmanians. TasCos was looking to this budget for a significant commitment to increasing the supply of social housing, but disappointingly, we saw more of the same. While we welcome announcements of new money for Gyra House and Macomb House, other measures are unlikely to meaningfully improve housing affordability, including the extension of the first homeowner grant at a reduced rate, a measure that many economists argue actually increases house prices. End of quote. And Shelter Tasmania, the peak body for housing and homelessness in the community services sector, said this in their post-budget comments, and I'll quote, "Tasmania is in the midst of a housing crisis, and we know that rising rents are a major contributor to cost of living issues for Tasmanians. Housing prices and rental costs are growing much faster than people's incomes, and the worst impact is felt by those who can least afford it." They went on to say, Mr President, more than 40,000 households are under rental stress in an increasingly competitive private market. Support must be prioritised for the lowest incomes, which is why Shelter Tas's key ask for this budget is to increase the supply of social and affordable rental homes. But, Mr President, they then observe that 1 in 3 Tasmanian households are now struggling with rental affordability, exacerbated by growing demand for short-stay accommodation. And they have the damning comment, of course, and say this: increases in short-term rentals like Airbnb are adding to the housing crisis. There are now 9,669 total short-stay properties in Tasmania. Over 4,700 of these are entire homes that have been removed from the long-term rental market. We know, Mr President, that this is a significant factor here that we cannot ignore, and yet this government continues to ignore it. A short stay levy does not fix it, especially if you're not going to direct that money into social and affordable housing, hypothecating it for a purpose to offset the harm that's being done by the short stay market in our private rental market. We know there's been a 45% increase in homelessness between the 2016 and the 2021 census. It would only be growing since then also. And there are persistently high rents in our private rental market because we do nothing to ensure that those aren't in a race to the top under our current laws. And it's causing more Tasmanians to face homelessness. It's causing more Tasmanians to apply for social housing. That's why we have those record numbers, the 5,533, which is actually the applicant number. But when you're talking about how many Tasmanians are on the waiting list, it's 9,000 Tasmanians. That's an increase of 9.2% in the last 12 months. Waiting times have blown out to 104 weeks. An independent analysis for Shelter Tasmania shows that more than 500 additional social housing homes need to be built every year until 2041 to meet demand. That's not what's being delivered by this government in this budget, and there is no intention for this government to actually solve this issue for our state if we go by what's presented in these budget papers. Priorities, Mr President. Budgets are about priorities. This is clearly not one. I also have concerns, Mr President, around the machinery of government changes, around the scrapping of Department of State growth and what that's going to mean in this space. It's certainly going to have an impact. It's on the record here from that time just a few short years ago when we passed legislation here to form Homes Tasmania, which I opposed at the time because it was inappropriate to take all that functionality out of a government department, put it at arm's length from accountability for the minister in charge, and put it under a skills-based board which would apparently leverage lots of wonderful debt and have lots of innovative ideas and deliver well and truly on solving our housing crisis here, which of course, as we know, absolutely did not happen, Mr President. None of that happened. And now we have the demolition of Department of State growth, We have the creation of Building Tasmania as a new department entity. Quite rightly, I think it is good to be bringing Homes Tasmania now back within a government department environment. I think that's where things should be focused in this space. That's where accountability should lie in this space. So that's not necessarily a bad outcome. The thing that does concern me, though, is that in the space of our housing and homelessness supports, there are a lot of different levels of services and support delivered, Mr President. It's not all just about building homes and construction, and yet our housing and homelessness services are going to be put into an entity called Building Tasmania. Now, parts of what we do in those services and supports might fit under an entity called that, but I'm really concerned that we're putting housing, a whole range of housing support services and homelessness support services into something called Building Tasmania, because I don't think that's where they would belong, Mr President. So I'm going to be watching really carefully how that plays out as the demolition of state growth progresses during this year. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that does provide for more accountability back to the Minister of the Day and the Government of the Day. I do note other members, I think it was a member for Murchison who commented on the fact, it might have been another member as well, that we have a very interesting situation where we're dismantling Homes Tasmania, we're claiming savings out of that process, but we don't appear to be potentially acknowledging the liabilities that come with that too, because of course Homes Tasmania has a lot of liabilities, a lot of debt that it carries as well. So that's going to be an interesting shifting and moving of numbers on pages to see where we end up in that equation, Mr President. Another area that I wanted to speak about was the area of digital inclusion. So digital inclusion is something that is foundational in a modern community. Digital inclusion relates to both access and capacity in terms of digital people being fluent and able to access digital services and supports and actual just functionality in their daily lives. Digital inclusion through that access and capacity are essential building blocks for a successful modern community and an economy. Just as we need a workforce of people in high-vis vests and steel-toed boots to do construction work, we also need the infrastructure and education and skills to ensure digital competence and innovation. And in fact, those people in the high-vis vests need that too, Mr President, in a modern environment. And I think it is absolutely crystal clear the government is dropping the ball on this one. This government is ignoring the huge digital inclusion challenge in our community, and in doing so it's undermining the ability of our state to thrive and for Tasmanians to live a good life. Our digital disadvantage affects all Tasmanians, but there are also particular impacts on various cohorts within our state, Mr President. And I did note that not only did TASCOS raise concerns around our poor investment, or actually a complete lack, really. In fact, in some cases, an undermining of previous investment in digital inclusion. We had groups like COTA in their budget response statement pointing to particular impacts for the cohort they represent, older Tasmanians, and the fact that the dropping of this ball by the government will actually play into a diminishment of services and supports for older Tasmanians in these places. And as they say, without targeted investment, many older Tasmanians risk being left behind as a result. TASCOS pointed out that despite TASCOS and others in the community services sector calling for greater investment in digital skills and literacy, that they had actually seen the Digital Ready for Daily Life program scrapped. They'd been calling for it to be doubled, Mr President, which, let's be clear, is a very modest amount. Doubling would have only brought it up to $400,000 a year. Pretty modest investment. Instead of going with their recommendation and seeing the benefit of that play out in the Tasmanian community, we've seen it scrapped. And they've even pointed out that Libraries Tasmania, a critical enabler of digital access and skills, has also received a funding reduction in this budget. So things are coming from left and the right, Mr President, on all sides. Digital inclusion is, rather than being regarded as essential infrastructure and supported, it's being undermined in this state and in this budget. TASCOS, of course, continues to call for there to be a reinstatement of investment and an improvement in investment in that space. I don't know when this government thinks it's going to be the right season for digital inclusion investment in this state, Mr. President. But my goodness me, at the moment, I think we're in the winter of seasons in that area. And it's one of those things that seems intangible in many ways, because it's not about putting a brick on top of another brick, or it's not about, putting a great big steel beam up and all that sort of thing. You don't have to wear high vis for it. But actually, in a modern environment, we know we are already behind here. If we continue to allow ourselves to fall further and further and further behind, we will never have the opportunity to catch up. And a small place like Tassie has so many opportunities for innovation, for new thinking, for actually leaping ahead when it comes to the digital space. Because we don't necessarily have to be one of the large jurisdictions, one of the other states, in order to become a leader in some of these fields. But rather than that, we're falling behind, Mr. President. Mr. President, the expected savings, or let's be clear and call them cuts, that the health sector is defined in this budget is $131.4 million in this 26-27 year alone. This is a sector, our health sector, which is already described as struggling and broken by those professionals who work in it. Yet, to assist in these savings, which form the budget's bottom line, there's no details or plan for delivery of savings, while also showing us how necessary services and healthcare will be maintained. This is a significant omission and a failure by the government. Over the decade, from 2025-26, we know health costs have increased by an average, over the decade to 25-26, we know health costs have increased by an average of 8.5% each year. Yet apparently this can just be turned around in a sustainable manner without impacting on service delivery to the value of over $700 million over the forward estimates cut. And we also meant to presume that the decades-long of increase in demand in both the acute and the emergency wards is suddenly going to decrease. I don't think so, Mr. President. I really don't think anyone's deluded enough to think that. So we're not going to meet what we would normally expect to be the inflation rates in health each year. We're not going to meet what would be expected in terms of increased demand each year. Instead, we're going to cut to ribbons what's there. Struggling and broken is our starting point, Mr. President. God help us where we end up at the end of the forward estimates. And in this space, something that's often overlooked, or actually more likely, it tends to be presented as a trivial afterthought or a trivial sort of little bauble on the side, is preventative health, of course, Mr. President. Because we know that ultimately, if we want to take the pressure off our acute and emergency healthcare services, we need to have a significant uplift in what we do in the preventative health space. We need to stop people ending up in hospitals. We need to stop people ending up in emergency wards. And we do that through preventative health measures. It is absolutely rock solid, research proven that to make a tangible improvement in preventative health, which would then flow through into taking pressure off your acute health systems, we need to invest at least 5% of a health budget in the preventative health space. That's the research proven quantum. What we're looking at, and I'm quoting here from TASCOS's work analysing the budget, what we're looking at is we've got preventative health investment. If it was to be 5% of our health budget, it would then be about $183 million a year based on this budget. That's what we should be looking at putting into preventative health. Instead, the budget delivers a modest first step of $5 million per year over the forward estimates on preventative health. Should be $183 million a year, it's $5 million a year. Now that makes things very plain, Mr. President. We cannot achieve what we should be achieving in preventative health with such a paltry investment in it. And the government may well point to its 20-year preventative health strategy that it's put together, all well and good. But if it amounts to nothing but a hill of beans in terms of an actual outcome at the other end, then that's actually just busy work. That might be nice and glossy and sits on a shelf, but if all we're investing in it in $5 million a year, it's nothing. It's not enough. It won't actually assist us with our health challenges in this state, our healthcare challenges in this state. Many out there in the health space, in the community services space, consistently call for a reshuffle of investment to direct more into the preventative health space. It's an investment in the future, Mr. President. It's a tough ask in the short term, sure, but if we want tangible difference down the line, that's what we need to do. We don't change a trajectory unless we invest up the top end of the stream when it comes to needs and demand. Mr. President, a couple of times already I've pointed to work of COTA in terms of a response to the budget. That's the peak body for older Tasmanians. I've got a particular interest. It has extended from the very first job I had in the community services sector, where I worked in community aged care, Mr. President. I maintain a very strong policy interest in the area of support and services and policy settings around older Tasmanians. So I did take a bit of a look and looked at what others were commenting on in this space with this budget. And I do note that we did have a really, I think, certainly thought at the time, an interesting and positive development where less than 12 months ago, we had a Minister for Ageing appointed at a state level here by the government. I thought that was welcome and a good development. And that's the Minister for Ageing appointed less than 12 months ago. Should have been a gesture towards showing priority and support for this cohort of Tasmanians. And we should have been able to see that, I think, demonstrated in the budget when we looked here, given that we've gone down that path. But when I look at the COTA State Budget Response Statement, this is what they had to say about that. And I'm going to quote from it. I'm quite happy to put the words of our community services peak bodies here on the parliamentary record, Mr. President, because they're the experts in this space. This is what COTA had to say. Budgets are about more than numbers. They are a tangible annual statement of what a government values, what it prioritises and who it sees. In an ageing Tasmania, that must include the 40% of Tasmanians now aged 50 and over, a proportion that continues to grow. These are the people who have contributed to and shaped the Tasmania we are proud to call home. As we move into later years, people need confidence that governments have planned for, adjusted to and can support their changing needs. The budget handed down last week did not reflect the realities of demographic change or the growing pressures facing older people across the state. Tasmania has the oldest population in the country, and yet this budget does not match the scale of that shift. Older Tasmanians are a significant and growing part of our community, and they deserve to be seen